ladies and gentlemen, I am delighted that my long-awaited visit to China finally is taking place. Firstly, because there is always excellent reasons for coming to China. And this time I came to China to hold a strategic dialogue with the Chinese government to lay ground for the future, before the end of the year, European Union-China summit that will take place here in Peking. And secondly, because as the Chinese proverb says, those who wait, time opens the doors. And that is exactly what is happening today. I waited, and the doors of Beida University have opened up, and that's a great honor for me. And I thank to all of you for your attention. I know this is a very prestigious university, established back in the late 19th century. It is a symbol of China's long and rich history. And history is important. History is very much important because if we want to understand each other, we have to know each other's history, because we are the product of our respective histories. We are the result of the many generations that came before us and built the history. History is a precious guide that can help us to understand and respect each other. But history should not be a straitjacket that can explain and justify everything. We need to remain faithful to our histories, to our respective histories, and to our cultures. That's what we are. But at the same time, we must be aware that the success of international relations, and international relations are also about power, depends on each of us being able to transcend constraints and differences so that we can work together for a prosperous and sustainable common future. We Europeans, we need to work with China, and China needs to work with us. And that is today more necessary than ever, since the world in which we live has become much more interdependent and at the same time much more conflictual. There are more conflicts in the world today. And our relations, the relations between China and the European Union, are not an exception to this trend. And this trend, I call it a conflictual interdependency. And my question, and the reason of my travel to China, is how can we make this interdependency be less conflictual? We will become interdependent. How can we be less conflictual? This is precisely the reason of my travel to China and our meeting here today. How can we share our different visions of the world, be frank about the obstacles that we face in our relations, and consider the ways and the means that we could use in order to improve them, or at least managing these relations more effectively? Ladies and gentlemen, let me start by telling you in a few words what is the European Union and how the European Union sees the world. You know that the European Union is a unique entity. In the political science, there is not a clear classification of the European Union. It's not a state. It's not a super state. It's not even a confederation of states. It's a club of states where each one of them, all of them remains a sovereign state. But at the same time, the members of the European Union have chosen freely to pool their policies in a certain number of areas to become much stronger and more effective, especially at the level of the world stage. And this union, far from weakening our members, has made them stronger at the international level. Look at the international negotiations, for example, on trade. A united Europe is much stronger than each member state could be alone. Each one individually could not have the same capacity to negotiate trade or investment agreements with the rest of the world. And thanks to that, the European Union has become a genuine economic power. At the beginning, it was just a trading power. Now it has become an economic power. And then came the war in Ukraine, and this has made the European Union a geopolitical power, much more than a trade or economic power. Today we are one of the poles of the multipolar world. What does it mean to be a geopolitical power? Well, it means that in our view of the world, we take into account much more the strategic and military balance of power. And why did it happen? Simply it happened because one day Russia attacked Ukraine, and this made us to realize that our security was under threat. This war has opened the eyes of the Europeans more to the real dangers of a world where the rules and the borders are violated, the rules and the borders. And at the same time, it has made us much more self-confident as we have demonstrated an unprecedented unity capable of delivering both humanitarian and military support to a country at war, Ukraine. So I would say that we are not afraid of a multipolar world as it is today. The times of the bipolar world or the unipolar world has gone. Our world is a multipolar one. It reflects the fact that we live in a world in which wealth has spread, and to increase the number of nations, especially China, and we welcome this. Nations that has becoming richer, taking hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. And that's why we are not at all opposed to the extraordinary economic rise of China. Nobody has the right to be and to have a permanent monopoly of power, and that's why we are not having any interest of opposing to the rise of China. But at the same time, I ask you to not to jump into a false conclusion. The conclusion that Europe, the old Europe, is declining. No, we are not. We have still a great asset. We are only 6% of the world population, but we share 15% of the global wealth. We are a very powerful trading power. We are also a normative power, carefully but quickly setting standards in many areas that today don't pay attention to geographical borders. There is no borders for data protection. There is no border for artificial intelligence. There is no border for climate change. The idea that the Western Europe was in decline made Mr. Putin commit big mistakes. He believed that we were weak, that we were afraid and far too dependent of Russian energy to take any action. However, in threatening us, It has made us much more resilient, stronger. And I think that we have a European perspective to offer, because there is indeed an European way of life, an European social model, an European approach when it comes to regulation of market activities. The world in which we live is multipolar, but it requires regulation. We need to agree on the basic common principles, and to agree on the basic common principles that regulate our common life, we call it multilateralism. And the real problem in our world today is that multipolarity has increased, but multilateralism has decreased. There are more players in the world game. There are more players, but less rules, or the rules are less fulfilled. The multilateralism is in crisis, and some have suggested that this crisis of multilateralism is because they don't reflect the world that was dominated by the West. But does it mean that the principles of the United Nations Charter are obsolete? Does it mean that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is obsolete? Does it mean that the United Nations agencies, funds and programs, as the World Trade Organization or World Health Organization or the International Labour Organization, are all obsolete? Well, if people want to change these institutions, they must explain very concretely why they want to change it, and more importantly, how they want to change it, and what they would replace to them. We don't question the need to reform of many international institutions. We know that they have to be reformed, including the United Nations Security Council, because many of the rules were adopted when many countries were still colonies. They didn't exist. Or other countries were economically less relevant than today. This change has to be done working constructively all together. We should not throw the baby with the bathwater. We have to build on what we have. For example, we have the G20. It's a group of countries, a good example of a political forum that brings together 20 countries that represent 80% of the world GDP. It's a good place to enhance economic coordination in the face of the global crisis that requires global responses. And certainly, it has worked. But the last couple of years have shown that we need to build better and stronger consensus. Which are the difficulties to buy this consensus? Because we diverge in difference in values. Clearly, let me be frank, China and the European Union, they are clearly not on the same page. China often says that each society has its own values, and I fully share this view. Each society has its own values, built on the history. However, it is also true that universal values go beyond the values of each individual country. They are bigger, they are more valuable than any one of our own values at home. And that's why I want to raise an important question. I think that China often misunderstands why we refer to China as a systemic rival. China tells us all the time, we are strategic partners. We are not rivals. In reality, we are both. We are both. We are partners and we are rivals. And we are also competitors in some areas. Allow me to elaborate on this very important issue. Look, at the United Nations Human Rights Council, China seeks to promote the idea that economic and social rights take precedency over political rights and individual freedoms. And we take a very different view, that all rights are equal and indivisible, and that economic rights are perfectly compatible with political rights. And by having this different approach, we have different views. And these different views bring us to a certain rivalry, but a peaceful rivalry. It's a rivalry rooted in a lack of compatibility between our values, but is not a gesture of hostility. This rivalry will persist because we have different political and economic systems, but it should not prevent us from working together. I will back to this very important point later. But let me now say that in order to face the real challenge of a form of multipolarity on the foundation of shared values, we have to prevent the fact that the rule of the stronger prevail. We have to avoid that the strength makes the right. We have to prevent the right of the stronger. And for that we have to build rules. The rules precisely exist to protect the small against the big, the less wealthy against the rich. And our commitment to multilateralism is back our record of accomplishment, and we are the biggest supporter of the United Nations. And we try to abide by the rules, living by multilateralism, which cannot be based on cherry picking, accepting the rules of the WTO, but not those of the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea. We cannot choose the laws that we want to fulfill. The system has to be fulfilled completely. The system is indivisible. And let me go to another topic, which I would like to speak about, which is our economic relationship. I suppose there are many students of economic science here, and you study certainly the economic relationship between the European Union and China. So let's discuss about it. We are a major market export for China, equally that the United States. China and the United States is at the equal level for us. So you need the European Union. The problem comes from the fact that this trade relationship has been very much imbalanced. And this imbalance continues to grow. Our trade deficit with China has increased by 60%, 60% increase in 1 year. This is a very important rise. And this increase on the trade deficit, every economist knows that cannot be only reflecting a productivity gap between our economies. I think that this imbalance is not only quantitative, it's also qualitative. It affects sectors in which we enjoy a comparative advantage, from medical devices to chemicals. And then we believe that the problem is not rooted in a simple difference of productivity, then which is the cause? To my mind, to our mind, the cause is the result of persistent difficulties experienced by European companies when they want to gain access to the Chinese market. There are many difficulties, which I will not list here, but which have been brought to the attention of the Chinese authorities in many constituencies. And on top of this enormous trade deficit, we have seen a sharp downturn in the European investments in China. Today, the European investments in China are at the lowest level since 2018. It has been decreasing, and today they are at the lowest level of the last 5 years. Companies that are still investing in China are the ones who already were here. They continue investing in China. They reinvest their profits in China, but there are not many new entrants into the Chinese market. And without better access to the Chinese market, what we see is that European investors are turning away. On the same token, there is the question, the famous question, very much mentioned today, of the so-called de-risking, something on which so much has been written lately. What is de-risking? In essence, it's an attempt to diversify the risk resulting from excessive dependence on one market. It was learned when the COVID came. It was learned when the Russian invasion. When the COVID came, we discovered that we didn't produce a single gram of paracetamol in the whole pharmaceutical industry in Europe. When the war came, we discovered that we were dependent 40% on the Russian gas. And we have to reduce these dependencies, and we have done it very quickly and at high cost. And look today at our economic relationship, 2.3 billion euros per day. Every day we trade 2.3 billion of euros. This benefits both sides. But we have to be alert because almost 195% of our imports in key sectors, key for the digital revolution, come from the one source. So de-risking is diversification of suppliers. When you need a product and you depend 93 or 97% of imports from magnesium, lithium, and rare earth, all of them coming from China, it's common sense to widen our suppliers. And I am sure that in a similar situation, China could do the same thing. In fact, you too have been pursuing an industrial and technological self-reliance for years. We didn't invent the de-risking. Maybe we invented the name, but not the fact. We are just trying to take actions to protect our economies when we consider that we have become too dependent on a limited number of markets. At the end, President Xi expressed a similar view when in 2020 he said China must build a domestic supply system that is independently controllable, secure and reliable so that self-circulation can be accomplished at critical moments like a pandemic or a war. So this is the risking also with Chinese characteristics. Beyond technicalities, let me draw your attention to a much more important problem concerning European public perception of the role that China is playing today. The public opinion in Europe concludes that the trade imbalance with China is so great that endangers key sectors or place our transition towards climate neutrality at risk, and it will demand drastic protectionist measures. Our leaders are naturally sensitive to the public opinions and what their voters want. And we are 1 year away from the European elections. We will have European elections very soon, and this topic of the trade imbalance with China will certainly come up and be one of the most important things that we will be discussing politically in Europe. So it is in our interest to find common ground to redress this imbalance in our economic trade relations. Otherwise, we will have to accelerate the risking far more than good, that the public opinion will increase its pressure on political leaders to disengage more from China. And we don't want to disengage, and much less to decouple from China. By the contrary, we need to continue working together because we need each other in order to face the global challenges of the world. It's impossible to solve the climate change challenge without a strong engagement from China, because you are using more coal than the rest of the world together. And this brings me to the important fact, which is the fundamental philosophical question, the level of trust between China and the European Union. Trust is at the core of any human relationship. And let's recognize that our common trust has been eroded. And we have to work to rebuild this trust. It will not come back miraculously. It will not be by a miracle that trust will come. It has to be restored working on it. How? How can we rebuild trust? Well, increase our human interactions. It's therefore very much important to resume human exchanges between Europe and China, personal, economic, scientific. They are at a very low level, considering the scale of our relationship. They are too low, and China often complains about that. And maybe you are right. We have to work more in order to understand each other better. And if we want to understand each other better, it's not enough with official delegations. It's not enough with ministers visiting ministers. We need people interact with people. We need more Europeans to come to China and to study Chinese. I was in an American university, a very nice American university, and Chinese is a language that every student has to study. They cannot choose. They have to study Chinese, which shows the importance of the Chinese language today. Human interactions are fundamental, and human interaction happens through the language. We cannot use always a translator or an interpreter. We should be able to talk each other with our languages. And then we have to avoid the decoupling at the human level. Economic decoupling is impossible because we are too much coupled. But human decoupling has to be mended. We have to engage more with each other. And China holds the key to do it. I am pleased to learn that China is planning to amend the legislation in order to transfer data for foreign companies. We need gestures of this kind if we want to restore trust. We need also to talk about political trust. There are plenty of work to be done, especially since the outbreak of the war in Ukraine. This is a very serious issue. For us, it's an existential issue. It's a threat. And Europeans have felt that China, who is not supporting Russia, certainly not, maybe has not been using its strong influence to persuade Russia to halt this aggression. And we perceive an ambivalent position of China with regard to Ukraine and Russia, which is difficult to understand, because what's happening there is simply that one country is being attacked by other that belongs he's stronger, and he could win the war. We know that there are China political constraints. We are not asking China to adopt the same standpoint as the European Union, but we consider essential that China makes a major effort to convince the people of Ukraine that China is not Russia's ally in this war. I think China should step up humanitarian assistance to Ukraine. Why not? China could propose a high-profile cultural initiative for the Ukrainian people, whose historical and cultural heritage is being destroyed by Russia. This would improve the image of China in Europe. This will improve dramatically China's image in Ukraine and put China in a good position to contribute to the reconstruction of Ukraine when the time will come, because it will come, and I hope sooner than later. We know that China's interests are different from Russia. We know that China wants to engage with Europe. We all know that the Russian aggression has reinforced the Atlantic Alliance. 2 new nations are joining this alliance because they know that they cannot trust Russia, which is now seen all over Europe as a source of fear. A last word about security. Security is an important aspect of the relationship of trust between Europe and China. This means that we express our concerns to you, and we have also to listen to your concerns. And I know that the most important concern for China in security issue is certainly Taiwan. I will talk a lot about Taiwan with my Chinese counterparts today. And regarding Taiwan, the European Union position is clear. No recognition of Taiwan as an independent state, no to any kind of coercion and provocation from any side, not to the use of force. Yes, we have bilateral ties with Taiwan, which don't imply at all any kind of political recognition as an independent country. We will not do it. But we have to solve the tensions through meaningful and open dialogue, keeping channels of communication to prevent misunderstandings and to de-escalate tensions. I think we have to be clear in this matter if we want to restore trust, in order to avoid any kind of economic or human decoupling, which would be indesirable, if not impossible. We, as I said, have to work together in order to fight climate change. The position that China will adopt at the next COP28, especially in more ambitious climate-related targets, will send an important message to the rest of the world, given your strong influence and your pivotal position as the world's largest gas emitter. We want China to become more involved in a multitude of issues. Climate change is the most relevant one, but also global health and the challenge of reducing debt in developing countries. You have become the big banker of the developing world. You are the biggest banker of the developing world today. And of course, we believe that despite our considerable differences that should not be underestimated, there is a lot of scope, a lot of room for us to work together. We have to still broaden that scope. We have to build trust. We have to understand, have to know better each other. We have to make our interdependency less conflictual, because the world cannot afford China and the European Union not sharing the same efforts to solve the great problems of mankind. We take China very much seriously. We admire the extraordinary performance of this country over the last years. Extraordinary. I think in the history of mankind there is not another example of such a bright success. We have to take China seriously. and I expect China to take also seriously the European Union.